We begin the Lenten season with the temptation story that you just heard. Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The wilderness, not a place to go backpacking, but a place of struggle. And the Spirit led him there to be tempted by the devil or Satan or the tempter, which was really just the first century way of trying to describe or to personify the wrestling between what we see as good and evil. And whatever we make of this through our 21st century perspective, clearly the confrontation with evil was instructive, was necessary even. And at the root of it, maybe that's exactly what Lent is about, that confrontation with ourselves. Jesus finds himself in a situation. He was alone, he was hungry, and he is confronted with choices. Choices that would determine his humanity. Choices that would determine his ability to be who he was to become. And as you heard, he's confronted with 3 temptations. Turn these stones into bread, and Jesus refuses. Well, why? He refused to set aside the laws of nature, because this is not how the world should be. We don't make bread from stones. And he decides not to take the path of convenience. He knew it was an unsustainable choice. The second temptation, throw yourself down, the angels will catch you, and Jesus refuses. He knew that hubris was antithetical to his nature, but he also refused to let someone else take responsibility for his irresponsibility. He was adamant about not giving in to the notion that someone will save me no matter how I act. The third temptation, I'll give you all these kingdoms if you but fall down and worship me. And Jesus refused to worship the wrong thing. He was clear about his allegiance. And he knew that to grab power and fame would destroy his mission of love and inclusion. He made his choices. He was also clear that the greatest battle is within. Anybody with me so far? And beloved community, our capacity to make choices is the greatest power we have. That's a good statement right there. Our capacity to make choices is the greatest power we have. It's no news to anyone that our world's a bit of a mess. I love G.K. Chesterton's response, the great author. When asked what is most wrong with the world, he said, I am. He knew how to take personal responsibility. And while we're not to blame for everything, we surely are complicit in far too much of what is wrong in the world. And Lent is a time to confront that. But I guarantee you this series that we're doing in Lent is not going to be a downer. It's going to be filled with joy and with hope and resilience and with courage and with collective imagination. But before we get to that piece, let's just talk about for a moment kind of what we're up against. Jim Mantell was here a few weeks ago for our climate event. He's a UCC minister. And I was so inspired by him, I'll say that more about that later. But here's some of these things he reminded us of. The 5 hottest years on record are the past 5 years. Since 1950, the number of floods across the world has increased by 15-folds, extreme temperature events by 20 times, and wildfires, which we know in California all too well, increased 7-fold. Our oceans are warming at a rate almost half again as fast as we thought only 5 years ago. A quarter of the world's population are one drought away from running out of water. The Greenland ice sheet is now melting 7 times faster than it was in the 1990s. 70% of CO2 emissions come from the richest 20% of people in the world. And the ways our current leaders of the federal government are wrecking God's creation are too numerous to mention. That's the bad news. But there's good news. Here's the thing. The climate crisis is more than upon us. It's been upon us and increasing. But our evolved brains are almost unsuited to the threat of climate change. When there's an immediate threat, we react and we respond. But when we see graphs and hear statistics, not so much. We have not found a way, collectively, to engage our emotional brains when it comes to the severity of climate change. Are you with me? I want you to think about it just for a moment. Many of us have concerns, many people do, about the coronavirus. And people are preparing. It's on our minds. Am I wrong? Our brains, it feels immediate. It feels like it might impact us at any moment. Even if we're not alarmists, we're just being prepared, we're realistic about what could be. So we prepare, we make changes, we do things differently. We are not as ready to do that when it comes to things around climate change. I guarantee you we will fundamentally change the way we do things around something like the coronavirus. But we have not been willing to do that because we're not engaged. Our brains and hearts are not engaged enough around climate crisis to make the kind of changes that will be needed for a sustainable future. Are your brains taking this in? So, what does that mean? It means if it's difficult to engage our brains in a way that really allows us and leads us to the kind of change that we need, then we need that heart space. We need some good old, as people would say, conviction of faith to do the right thing. We need head and heart. And that's why I'm so convinced that this is our calling right now. I've been preaching on this subject since the mid-90s. I've been preaching on environmental justice, loving the earth as God's body that is holy. Back in the late 90s, I did a sermon series on our ecological footprint, but I have not done nearly enough. And I confess that I am overdue to be the kind of leader on this that I need to be. So why now, you might ask? Series of events happened that engaged my conviction. The first is that the Ministry of Energy and Environmental Justice came to me and in a very loving way basically said, "You're not doing enough." At least that's what I heard. And you know what? They were right. The second thing is I met Jim Antel. And the guy's deep in the science and even deeper in the hope and joy. And I saw it was possible to be both. And then he said something that moved me so much. He said that the climate crisis is a social injustice accelerator. That it accelerates every issue of social injustice. Well, if you know me, you know that captured me. Because all the issues I care about so deeply are accelerated by the climate crisis. And it's then that I stepped up and said, use me, Lord. I want to be a leader, a faith leader on this. Because let's be very honest. In general, the Christian religion has not been helpful over the centuries and years in this. And if that all weren't enough, I came across this quote by Martin Luther King Jr. His friends told him to stick to civil rights and to not talk about poverty and to not talk about the war. They pushed him on it. And he turned to them and said, I cannot segregate my conscience. And I have come to that place in my own life. So I'm looking together for us to have a moral and faithful response. Walter Brueggemann, the great writer and prophet, said, the great question now facing the church is whether our faith allows us to live in a new way. So what does it mean to follow the teachings of Jesus in a climate crisis world? It might mean actually that we have to reshape our understanding of what it means to be a faithful, progressive Christian, or even a faithful spiritual person. It might mean that we have to reshape our thinking and our identity about what it means to be a church. I see that one over big. Okay, good. What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? Okay, clearly, in general, what we've been doing is not working. We need to widen and deepen our response and our following. We need to return to some of the choices Jesus made. He refused convenience. He refused to let someone else take responsibility. And he refused to worship the wrong thing. He refused to choose convenience. And let's face it, choosing convenience is at the heart of so much that has got us to this place already. And here in this society, tell me you're not like me. If it's convenient, I'll spend a little more money. If it saves me time, I'll bend my principles just slightly. Convenience is not a religious value. Convenience is a business value. It's a profit-driven value. It's a media value. It's not a spiritual value. We put a lot of energy into making our lives convenient, and what if we use that energy instead and joined a movement? We don't have the luxury of feeling powerless. And actually, I don't mean to offend. I say this to myself first. It is irresponsible, I believe, for us to say, well, what I do doesn't make a difference. That's individualistic thinking. It's not just what I do, it's what I do in my own life because it's the right thing to do, but it's what we do together that makes a difference. We can't let someone else take responsibility for our irresponsibility over time. We have worshiped the wrong things, we have prized the wrong things, and we have sacrificed the environment on the altar of economic growth. And we have worshiped fossil fuels. Exactly. Exactly. And if we want little Owen back there to have a sustainable future, we have to let go of our insatiable desire for material wealth and growth, our insistence on convenience. But there's hope. When Jim Ental was here, we had a panel of faith leaders, and I happened to be on that panel. And the last question on the panel was about hope. And I confessed that I was kind of the downer on the panel at that moment. I said, I think that hope is not the word that comes to my mind. I think a lot of people are in hopeless situations. And I don't know that we can ask some people to have hope in some places in the world when we know that their lives are not going to get better. But then Jim said, but I want you to think about how the young people think about hope. They don't think about hope as optimism. They think about hope as engagement. And the minute he said that, something in my heart shifted. Hope as engagement. That kind of hope I can get with. And that's the kind of hope I'm asking you as a beloved community have. That kind of engagement. That kind of resilience. That kind of realism coupled with resilience. Hope is manifest in the ways that we engage, in the ways that people are showing up all across this nation and across the world, in the ways that the young people, not just Greta, but many across the world are stepping up, people that have lived with climate change their whole life. I'll end with this. I've heard this statement in a number of ways over the last few months. It's just come into my life from so many different sources. But that you and I have been given the gift of life at the most critical moment in the 2 million years humans have walked on the earth. It's as if we are living on the hinge of history, and it falls to us, our generation, all of us, to determine the fate of the earth and all of its inhabitants. And the first time I heard that statement, I thought it was dramatic. But about the fourth time I heard that statement, I thought, that is true. We are at an unprecedented time in our history, and it is up to us. Our capacity to make choices and to make them together is the greatest power we have. The scientists have done their job, the engineers have done their jobs, and as Bill McKibben says, it's time for the people of faith to do their job and fight like heck for the future. Amen. Amen.